As former Arkansas governor and 2024 presidential candidate Asa Hutchinson, who was listening to us talk about this. You've been concerned about the border for some time. First of all, great to see you. Thank you for being here. The White House is actually now taking credit for this decline that's happened over the weekend of migrants. Do you think they have any bragging rights at all for that?
Well, that's a little bit misleading because you had an enormous spike of migrants and apprehensions at the border, and obviously it's declined since then. But it was that spike that is an enormous challenge for us. You also see that this administration has adopted some of the policies of the previous administration. Right. And so they have toughened up their policy, but it is so late in what they have done. And I applaud them for making that change, but let's be straightforward about it. They've had to go back to some of the policies that were rejected earlier.
So in other words, just to put a fine point on it, they're taking credit for stemming the tide by using the tactics that were used by the previous administration that they criticized.
Which is absolutely necessary to get a handle on the border. The other thing that's very important is, and I think Attorney General Paxton was speaking of this, that the apprehensions, the migrants should not be released into our society until their cases are processed. They should be held until they can meet with an immigration judge, they can make their asylum request, they can make a legal determination as to whether they're entitled to status here in the United States. And so we've got to follow that legal system there. We can't just catch them and then release them in the United States and ask them to appear 4 years later. That, to me, is a fundamental point. The other thing that this administration is missing is really a focused effort to go after the cartel.
Yeah.
The cartel is one that's causing, and it is human suffering along the border.
And that cartel, by the way, is embedding itself in the United States right now, not just in the border either, in regions all over the country. As I mentioned A.G. Paxton, it's, New York is having problems elsewhere, and where the migrants go, very often the cartel is going with them.
Well, absolutely. I was head of the Drug Enforcement Administration. We saw the same challenge with methamphetamine coming into our country, that it was the criminal organizations that were not just bringing it across, but they were distributing in the United States. Right. And you see the cartel that's doing that today with fentanyl. And so this is something that impacts not just our border states, but impacts Arkansas, impacts New Hampshire, all across this country, and it's causing deaths. And the cartel is the one that is really responsible for that. We've got to be able to target them. Mexico is not cooperating. We need to be able to bring them on board to say this is undermining the rule of law, both in the United States and in Mexico.
And there's another threat to our national security, which is that we now have terrorists trying to come across the southern border. I mean, they may always have been there, but the ease with which people get through is not being lost on the terrorists outside of this hemisphere that are trying to get in, and they're getting it. And yet, let me just play for you something that the president said about the greatest threat to the United States, to our national security. He said this over the weekend. Roll tape.
A harsh reality that racism has long torn us apart. It's a battle that's never really over. The most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy.
Governor, what do you make of that?
Well, it didn't seem like it was that well received in the audience, but I've prosecuted white supremacists. I did that as United States attorney. It is a threat to our nation, particularly whenever they move into violence. But I would not call it the greatest threat. When you look at the greatest threat that we have, it's the security of people that we do not know who they are that might be coming to our country to harm us. And until we can get control on those that are coming into our country and make sure that we're protected there, I think we'd have to consider that our greatest threat.
But, there are consequences to the United States when the President of the United States says that is the greatest threat. You see the way that the FBI is making these kind of knee-jerk moves against this supposed greatest threat, calling, for example, conservative Catholics a threat to the United States. The FBI tried to pass that off. They were caught. They pulled back. But the fact that they would go after something like that, and of course the parents who were upset with what their schools were teaching, I mean, is there a total misdirection of law and order in this country because of cues that the FBI and others get from the president? president?
This is a very important point, and that's why the Durham report that came out today is so important, because they said the FBI has not applied the law effectively in a particular case, but from my experience, the FBI needs to be more focused. They need to be reformed. 3 weeks ago, when I announced for president, I said the FBI needs to be reformed. And so that's a major point, and really beyond the FBI. And they're good people. They have an important mission, but it needs to be more focused, and they need more accountable. All of the federal agencies, there's so many of those, and they overlap in jurisdiction. And the FBI has the biggest breadth of jurisdiction totally across the board, and that is one of the reasons that they're less accountable. They're more subject to misuse by the Department of Justice from a political standpoint. This has to be reformed, and it's going to take effort, and I believe the Durham report will be helpful to accomplish that.
You know, Governor, when I hear you talking about the border, about law and order in America, and we haven't talked about economics, but I'm sure you share views about that we're talking about as well from a conservative perspective. I wonder what differentiates you from the policies, not the man, but the policies of Donald Trump, who you would be running against for the nomination for the GOP.
Well, one of the big differences is that I'm not trying to tear down our institutions. I'll work against the establishment, but we have to remember how important our judicial system is in America. Let's reform it. Let's not dismantle it and discredit it. Whenever you're looking at our democracies, I want our democracy to work. I don't want it to be torn down. And so it's an optimistic view of America. At the same time, we're at a critical point, and we've got to change direction from the failed policies of the Biden administration. But we need new leadership that can win, and win in November, and bring in suburban voters and independent voters. And it takes someone with a different view and a different approach to the democracy that we have. And that's the reason I'm running, and that's the reason the economy is critically important. So there's more differences, and you'll see that on the debate stage, than simply rhetoric, and there'll be some subsidy differences that I think will be important.
By the way, I was talking to Vivek Ramaswamy, who's also running for the GOP nomination. He was worried that Donald Trump wouldn't come to the debates. What is your feeling? Have you any inside information about whether he will or not?
Not inside information, but I have my view on it. And one, if he's not there, we're going to have a really good debate on policy. And so that's the benefit of it. But if he doesn't show up, then it's going to hurt him in the polls. He'll drop, and he'll show up at a later debate. Thank goodness we're going to have multiple debates this year.
Of course, he could drop double digits and still be firmly in the lead.
He's got a big, gargantuan lead right now, and we're working very hard. I'll be going to Iowa from here for 3 days campaigning. And this is important, to meet the voters one-on-one in retail politics. That's where you win this, and that's how you change those polls.
Well, great to see you again, Governor. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.